The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning for those of you who are on the West Coast. My name is Paul Fenton. I'm the President and CEO of Montrium, and thank you for joining our webinar today, which is Validating Sharepoint for Regulated Life Sciences Applications. So today's webinar will focus on how we go about validating SharePoint within context of clinical and manufacturing organizations. Please stand by. Okay, sorry about that. So we'll get started. So today's webinar is the first webinar in a series of webinars which will be carried out over the next few weeks, which will be addressing how we can go about deploying, validating and managing SharePoint within the context of regulated applications. This webinar series will give you a good grounding on how to go about this particular activity to make sure that we can manage our SharePoint environment in a compliant manner. At the end of the webinar, we'll be giving you details on how you can actually request slides, and these slides will be distributed to attendees following the webinar. During the webinar, you should feel free to ask any questions in the question panel, and my colleagues are on hand to answer those questions. So today, we'll be looking first of all at the objectives of validation and what validation is all about. We'll also look at the regulatory requirements, so primarily 21 CFR Part 11, but also some of the other requirements that are out there. We'll look at how we go about identifying electronic records within the context of 21 CFR Part 11, and how we can use SharePoint within GXP environments. The second part of the webinar will focus on the different documents that we need to produce to be able to put together a validation pack for SharePoint. And then we'll talk finally about implementing effective configuration and change control procedures for SharePoint. We'll finish up by looking at how we can maximize quality and also provide return on investment for our validation efforts. We'll then look at some lessons learned and best practices before we then finish up with an overview of the subsequent webinars in this series. So first of all, what is computer systems validation? Computer systems validation is a process which allows us to ensure the systems consistently operate as they were intended. It also allows us to make sure that we meet user, business and regulatory system requirements. We also use computer systems validation to make sure that our information is secure and properly managed within the system, and that we have adequate procedures and processes in place for the use and management of the system. So let's now look at the regulations. And the primary regulation that most of us know is 21 CFR Part 11, of course, and it's section 1110A that speaks of validation. And so it goes on to say the validation of systems to ensure accuracy, reliability, consistent intended performance, and the ability to discern invalid or altered records. And that's really what we're trying to achieve. Within GCP, so Good Clinical Practice, ICHE 6, we also discuss the need to have validation. And so it's section 553A, which says that we need to ensure and document that the electronic data processing systems conforms to the sponsor's established requirements for completeness, accuracy, reliability, and consistent intended performance, i.e. validation. In addition to those key pieces of regulation, there's also the PICS guidance. So PICS is the Inspectorate Cooperation Scheme, and they've come out with a guidance which is really focused on Annex 11, which is the equivalent in Europe of 21 CFR Part 11. And this guidance, so the PICS 0.11.3, Good Practices for Computerized Systems in Regulated GXP Environments, is an extremely valuable document because it really gives us insight into what the inspectorate actually expects to see when inspecting systems for system documentation and computer systems validation. PICS is composed of a series of different inspectorates, including, of course, the EMA, FDA in the US, and Health Canada. The other piece of guidance which is important, even though it's more focused on GMP, is USA FDA General Principles of Software Validation, Final Guidance for Industry and FDA Staff. So this really gives us a good insight into the FDA's thinking when it comes to computerized systems validation. Although, as I said, this is very much more focused on GMP and medical device type applications. So what's really expected by the agency? The first thing is that procedures should be in place to make sure that any systems used within regulated activities which are required by predicate rule are adequately validated. That's really the baseline, of course. We also have an expectation, or the agencies have an expectation, that the system should be maintained in a validated state through the use of effective change control or maintenance. We also are required to take a risk-based approach now. This was reiterated recently with the issuance of the updated Annex 11 guidance in Europe, where the agencies really expect us to use risk assessment to be able to focus our validation efforts. And finally, there's an expectation that all individuals who are involved in these activities have the proper experience and training to be able to perform the validation and, of course, to maintain the systems. So how do we actually identify electronic records? Because this is very important for us to ascertain exactly what we need to validate. In 21 CFR Part 11, Scope and Application 2003, there was a very clear definition given by the agencies as to what they consider to be electronic records. And there are 4 different definitions of electronic records. The first is any records that are required to be maintained under predicate rule requirements and that are maintained in electronic format in place of paper format. The second type are any records that are required to be maintained under predicate rules that are maintained in electronic format in addition to paper format and that are relied on to perform regulated activity. So this is typically any electronic scan that you make of a record and that you maintain within a system and that you use to make regulated decisions or to drive regulated processes. The third is any record that's submitted to FDA under predicate rules, even if such records are not specifically identified in agency regulations. And so this is typically any record that we include within an ECTD submission to the agencies. And then finally, electronic signatures are also considered electronic records and should be governed as such. So if we now think about electronic records within the context of SharePoint, there are several elements of SharePoint that could be considered as electronic records. The first, of course, is documents. You know, we're actually using SharePoint a lot to manage documents or records, and these, of course, would be considered electronic records within the context of 21 CFR Part 11 if they were required by predicate rule. The other element is metadata, of course. Within SharePoint we have documents, but we also have metadata which enables us to describe those documents and manage those documents. And in some instances, metadata could also be used to drive regulated decisions or drive regulated processes. And in these cases, metadata could also be considered an electronic record. Within SharePoint, we also have a technology called InfoPath, which is an electronic form technology. And again, the InfoPath forms, if used for regulated purposes, could be considered electronic records. Electronic and digital signatures, if used within SharePoint, and there are several ways of doing that, either with native SharePoint capabilities or with external systems that integrate with SharePoint. And then finally, audit trails. So any audit trail that we generate on records would also be considered a record in its own right. So when we're thinking about systems and more particularly, of course, SharePoint, we need to think very carefully about what we're going to be storing within that system. And there are several key questions that we can ask ourselves to be able to determine whether 21 CFR Part 11 applies and whether the system should be validated or not. The first is, does the record exist in electronic format only with no paper source? Is the record or is the document an electronic copy of a paper record which is being used to drive regulated processes? Is the record itself required by predicate rule? And does the record drive a regulated process or decision? And if you answer yes to any of those, then 21 CFR Part 11 does apply, and therefore you should validate that system. You should also validate this decision within your validation plan. You have to very clearly describe exactly what the intended use of the system is, and by asking these questions, it helps us actually define that. So let's think now how we can use SharePoint within a GXP context, or within a regulated context. SharePoint itself is a web portal-based technology that's highly customizable and is also very user-friendly, and therefore typically can grow very quickly within an organization for both regulated and non-regulated uses. Within a GXP context, we can imagine SharePoint being used, of course, to manage documents and GXP records, to design electronic forms for the collection of data for everyday operational GXP activities. Examples of this could be, you could design monitoring reports, for example, in InfoPath. You could design reports or forms for the release of IP, things like that. We can also manage lists and trackers of information. Typically within our organizations today, we use a lot of Excel spreadsheets to be able to track operational information, so the famous trackers. And a lot of these trackers or access databases could actually be integrated into SharePoint in the form of lists and trackers. We can manage the distribution of information and collaboration between various different teams. Obviously today we work in a very global environment with teams typically spread across many countries and geographical areas, and SharePoint really provides us with tools to be able to better interact and collaborate with all of these different teams. We can also implement very interactive workflows which allow us to automate our processes and improve compliance with our SOPs. We can also generate metrics and KPIs and various different dashboards through the powerful business intelligence features of SharePoint, and this is extremely important within our industry and within clinical research and development and pharmaceutical manufacturing. Because of the complexity of the processes, it's very important to have insight. Now all of that sounds really good, and I'm sure that everybody on the call is interested in potentially using SharePoint, but it does come with its challenges as well. I think the biggest challenge is that SharePoint can get out of hand very quickly. It can quite often be a victim of its own success because it can be used in many different functional areas, and it can also be used within both regulated and non-regulated situations. We're finding that within the life sciences, most companies are now adopting SharePoint, but it's very important to control that environment so it doesn't get out of hand. Within the context of a regulated environment, it's very important that we have proper configuration control. We have to make sure that our system is going to continuously operate as intended, and therefore we have to have very formal procedures around configuration control. We also find that it's very granular. When we are dealing with document management, typically within our environment, within life sciences, we're dealing with a lot of documents. Everything we do is documented, and this can represent a significant challenge because we're having to define anywhere up to 600 different types of documents within the system, as well as all of the metadata and security that goes with that. So it's super important for any organization who are thinking about deploying SharePoint for GXP environments that they have a proper plan to be able to properly plan their architectures to ensure scalability and, of course, compliance. So let's now start talking a little bit about the core of the subject today, which is really validation and the need to generate documentation for validation. The way that we typically approach this within a SharePoint environment is really in three stages. The first stage is really the underlying hardware and the prerequisite software. And so prerequisite software, we're really talking about things like Windows or Microsoft SQL Server. And here we have to produce documentation to clearly show that we verified our hardware, that it meets the requirements of that software, and that we've also got an installation verification for our operating systems and our databases. And if we're using a virtualized environment, also for our virtualization software. So this is really the first step. From there, we'll then go to the baseline SharePoint validation. So this is really where we need to qualify our SharePoint installation to make sure that we meet the requirements of 21 CFR Part 11 electronic records. And so within this step, we produce certain documents such as specification documents, requirements documents, and then of course the validation documents to clearly demonstrate that our SharePoint environment is compliant with 21 CFR Part 11 and is operating correctly. And this is really the foundation to be able to then deploy specific applications on top of that environment. And this layer we'll be looking at in more detail today. So once we have that baseline SharePoint validation in place, we can then deploy third-party applications which integrate with SharePoint. And so quite often we'll use other applications as part of our regulated environment to be able to better drive processes, so things like Nintex, which help us build workflows, things like Cosign to apply digital signatures, which are Part 11 compliant, and then AdLib to be able to generate PDF, so submission-ready PDFs for submission to the regulatory agencies. These are examples of third-party applications. There are, of course, many others that could also be integrated. We also have our custom SharePoint applications and solutions. And so these typically can be things like web parts that we'll design and implement within that particular environment. And these are things that are very customized. And so here we need to have a whole series of different documents such as our functional and design specifications and our validation documents, as well as SOPs, of course, to manage those particular applications or solutions. And then finally we have our general SharePoint configuration. And this is really configuration of at 4 different levels. So the system level, the central administration level, at the user level, and at the application level. And here we'll have a whole series of different configuration specification documents which clearly define how we've actually configured SharePoint at these different levels. And we'll look at some examples later on in the presentation. We also, of course, need to have SOPs here to be able to manage the actual configuration of the system and when we make changes to those configurations. Now, when we go about validating any application for GXP environments, we need to use a risk-based approach. This is really what the agencies are looking for. And there's a very specific way of going about this. And so we need to, first of all, very carefully define how we're going to perform our risk assessment. There are definite advantages of doing a risk assessment. It allows us really to focus on the high-risk areas of the application whilst also reducing the validation effort and hopefully improving quality because we're much more focused. When we start to think about the deployment of SharePoint for regulated environments, it's very, very important for us to focus on these high-risk areas because SharePoint, of course, is an off-the-shelf system. So we don't really need to validate everything because there's already a lot of validation or testing that's been carried out by Microsoft. When we think about risk, we really think about risk in 2 different ways. We think about general procedural risk. So this is very high level, and this is really the first thing that we would do. So we would think very carefully about the different processes that we want to manage in that system. And then once we've done that, and once we've evaluated which processes we feel have high risk or regulatory risk, we'll then do a more detailed functional risk, which is typically done on user requirements. So risk can be really identified as either regulatory or business. And some companies will just perform a regulatory risk assessment. They're not interested in evaluating business risk. Other companies will perform both, in fact, depending on the kind of application. Obviously, if you do perform both, you're potentially increasing the amount of testing that you would need to do, but it may be important to the business to do that. When you're doing this, you must really make sure that you clearly specify that you're going to be adopting a risk-based approach in your validation plan and explain the rationale behind this. So you really need to say that, we feel that this application has regulatory impact that it's a high-risk application and therefore the risk approach that we're going to take is this, and clearly specify that. We also need to make sure that the risk assessment itself is carried out by a knowledgeable team. So when we do the risk assessment, we're really talking about the processes that that system is going to manage. And therefore the team that's involved in the assessment should really be multidisciplinary. We should have people from IT who understand the technical aspects of the system. We should have people from quality assurance, from regulatory, and also from the end user groups, so from the various different operational stakeholders who can all provide input to be able to define the risk scenarios and the palliative action that would need to be taken with regards to those risk scenarios. It's also very important to be very strict when we're performing a risk assessment, because otherwise everything can potentially end up being high risk with enough debate. And this is typically where we would actually try and have somebody who's fairly impartial or independent to actually manage the risk assessment exercise and actually govern the whole thing. So let's now talk about computer systems validation and what we call the CSV models. Within our industry, most companies typically use the GAMP standard, so it's Good Automated Manufacturing Practices, and we're actually currently at version 5, and this is really a framework that was produced by ISPE, and it's a framework which allows us to be compliant and achieve compliant GXP computerized systems. It's really something that's very widely recognized and understood by our industry, and it's also clearly stated and cited as an acceptable framework for computerized systems validation within the PICS guidance that I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar. GAMP provides us with various different categories of systems, and based on the type of system or the category of system, we're going to need to produce more or less documentation. And so the categories of systems go from non-configured off-the-shelf to fully customized systems. Within the context of Sharepoint, we consider it to be a configured off-the-shelf system. A configured off-the-shelf system will have already undergone a significant amount of validation during the development by the vendor, and therefore requires less validation effort than a fully customized system. Now, the way that the GAMP framework works is in what we call a V model. And so on the left-hand side, we have the various different specifications. So we have a user requirement specification, a functional specification, and a configuration specification. Now, this is within the context of a configured off-the-shelf system. If we were dealing with a fully customized system, we would actually have other documents as well, such as design specifications required. So based on these specifications, we're able to actually configure our product. And once we've configured our product, we go through a series of different testing phases or qualifications. And so the first is configuration testing. So it's really making sure that we deploy and configure our system correctly. And this is done through what we call IQ, so installation qualification. And this is done against our configuration specification. So everything always feeds back to our specifications. The next stage is functional testing, or OQ, operational qualification. And this is really verifying that the system is operating correctly in its installed environment. And we'll actually verify this against our functional specifications. The final stage is requirements testing, or PQ. And this really allows us to test the system and make sure that we're actually meeting our user requirements as specified. Once we've completed these phases of testing, we actually finalize the validation and we'll move the system into production. Once the system goes into production, we then have to use change control to manage any changes in a very formal way to that system so as to be able to maintain the validated state. And so change control typically will go through an impact assessment so that we can actually evaluate what impact that change has on the current system, and typically what would need to be changed and then what would need to be retested. And so we'll use our configuration management procedure to update our configuration specification, make changes to our configured product, and then go through this process again of testing. And that's really the way things work within the context of a configured off-the-shelf system. So let's now actually go through some of the different documents that we produce, and we're going to be looking at a very specific environment of validation documents that have been produced for SharePoint 2010 within the context of 21 CFR Part 11 electronic records. Now, the first document that we typically produce is a validation assessment, and this is a very important document because it allows us to provide a clear rationale as to our validation approach and what exactly has to be validated based on the intended use of the system. This is typically a document that would be presented to an inspector or to an auditor, and they would be able to read this document and really understand, how you went about validating SharePoint and really understand the approach that you took and why. So within this, the first thing that we do is we'll state the intended use, and this is very important from a regulatory standpoint because we have to show that the system meets its intended use. And so within the context of SharePoint 2010 baseline qualification, the intended use is for the management of electronic records within the context of 21 CFR Part 11. And we actually go further and clearly define exactly what we consider to be electronic records within the system. So we specify that these are documents, data, so the metadata columns, infopath forms, and audit trails. So this already gives us a very clear scope for our validation. The next thing that we do is we ask a series of different questions which allow us to define whether we need to validate this system or not. In this particular case, everything was no apart from question 7, which was, does the system create, modify, maintain, archive, retrieve, or transmit records that must be available for inspection by a regulatory agency? And basically, if any of the answers to these questions is yes, we consider the system needing validation. Now, the next step of the process is for us to actually go and look at each part of 21 CFR Part 11, so each section, and actually evaluate how we're going to meet that requirement. So in this example, we can see that we're dealing with 1110C, which is the protection of records to enable their accurate and ready retrieval through the records retention period. And within our assessment, we're going to clearly define the technical controls as well as the procedural controls that we can put in place or that exist within SharePoint to be able to meet this requirement. So we can see here very clearly that we have technical controls where we actually explain the functionality of SharePoint that we're going to be using. We then cross-reference the SOPs that we're using to meet the procedural controls. So here we're talking about having a backup process as our procedural control to be able to meet this part of the regulation. So we'll actually cross-reference our SOPs here. We'll also cross-reference user requirements in our user requirement specification, which describes how we meet the technical aspects. So this really allows us to go through every single part of the regulation and clearly describe how we intend to meet it. Once we have our validation assessment, the next document, which is also an extremely important document, is the validation plan. And this really governs the whole validation process for the system. Within the validation plan, we're going to have our validation scope and our risk rationale. So if you remember, we were speaking about risk assessment earlier. Basically, based on that risk assessment, we'll actually have a very clear scope of our validation and what we intend to validate because it's high risk or medium risk, and what we intend not to validate because we feel that it doesn't pose any risk or it only has business risk or low regulatory risk. And this changes from company to company. It's really based on your intended use of the system. We'll also describe the validation approach and any prerequisite requirements. So there may be other systems that need to be validated before we can validate this. And if you remember when we spoke about the documentation, we have the hardware as well as the operating system and the database server that would need to be validated or qualified before we could actually qualify SharePoint. And so we would clearly state that in our validation plan. We also would list out all of the documentation deliverables that we would need to produce for that system, typically based on our SOP or on GAMP. And then finally, we'll outline all of the roles and responsibilities. Now, the validation plan should be fairly high level, and it also should be fairly flexible because it's really going to govern the whole validation process. It needs to be flexible, but it also needs to be very, very clear about what's required to achieve compliance. So what are the acceptance criteria? Now, if SharePoint is going to be deployed in a controlled and non-controlled configuration, so this is really using SharePoint for both regulated and non-regulated activities, we should clearly state that we're only actually going to be validating the system for the controlled environment or for regulated activities. So within the scope, we can see this is an example from a validation plan. We can see here that we've clearly specified that the scope of the validation effort will be restricted to out-of-the-box SharePoint 27 functionality, which is configured to satisfy the regulatory requirements of 21 CFR Part 11, Subpart B, electronic records. And that's really our validation scope. And so we're not going to validate anything else apart from the functionality required to meet that regulation. So we actually clearly specify what is out of scope. So out of scope is any customizations that address specific business needs that are not related to 21 CFR Part 11. The reason why we do this is because we're going to deploy regulated applications on top of this foundation. And so typically for our regulated applications, we'll also have a series of validation documents which will really describe the functionality and the approach that we're taking to validate those applications which are deployed on top of this. We also describe our validation approach, so the various different activities that we're going to be carrying out to actually validate our system. And so it's very important that anybody involved in this validation effort are trained on this document so that they can really understand their role and also the various different activities that are going to occur. We have our deliverable list, so this is really the various different documents that we need to produce, as well as the SOPs and any prerequisite documents that we should have in place. So when we're putting in place regulated systems, it's not sufficient just to provide the system with the validation documents. We also have to have SOPs to manage our environment as well. Finally, we have our roles and responsibilities, and typically we have very high-level roles which are actually aligned to the regulations. In Annex 11, we have very clear indications of system owner, process owner. And these are the terms that we use because they're familiar to the inspectorate. We'll actually assign people to each of these different roles. And then afterwards, we'll have a responsibility matrix, which clearly describes who does what for each of the various different deliverables. So once we have our validation plan in place and it's approved, the next document that we need is a requirement specification. And the requirement specification typically defines all of our business requirements, so our user requirements, our functional requirements for the system, any performance requirements, regulatory requirements, of course, and then system architecture and security requirements. And all of these can be put into one requirements document, or it could be several. It's really up to you, and it depends on your SOP as well. Whenever you're defining requirements, it's extremely important to make sure that those requirements are precise and measurable, because requirements really are the foundation for all of the other documents. And when we actually test the requirements, we need to be able to measure those tests, so they have to be testable. We use requirements to develop our test scripts, and you'll see very clearly when we actually get onto the test script piece how we link back to those requirements. Within the context of SharePoint and the validation pack that Montrium provides for SharePoint, we actually limit everything just to 21 CFR Part 11 requirements. We don't really need to test other aspects of SharePoint, such as things like check-in or check-out, or integration with Microsoft Word, for example, because these are all things that have been tested by Microsoft and have no real regulatory impact for us. Other requirement specifications would also be produced for the SharePoint applications that you're actually going to deploy on top of your qualified foundation. So this is an example of a requirement specification for SharePoint within the context of electronic records. And so here we're dealing with the requirement for audit trail. And so we have 6 different requirements which clearly describe what we actually need to have in place to be able to meet 21 CFR Part 11 requirements for audit trail. And so from this, we'll be able to then define our specifications on how we're going to configure SharePoint to be able to meet this requirement. So once we have our user requirements, the next document that we need is a functional and configuration specification. Now this is not a full functional specification for those of you who get involved a lot in system development. This is really just a specification which describes SharePoint functionality and how it's going to be used to meet those requirements. We also describe in this document how we actually need to go and configure SharePoint. So what are the various different steps for configuring things such as the record center for us to be able to store final records and apply retention policies. For certain aspects of SharePoint elements, so things like info path forms and workflows or any custom web parts or even integration with third-party applications or services to be able to pull information into SharePoint or push information out, would require additional functional specifications and maybe in some cases also design specifications, and that's really outside of the baseline functional configuration spec. So this is an example of that particular document. So the first part is really the mapping of user requirements to functional specifications. So if we look at the first user requirement, so user requirement 6, the system must integrate with Active Directory in order to limit system access to authorized individuals only. Here we describe how SharePoint meets that. So SharePoint integrates with Active Directory to ensure that only authorized Active Directory accounts can access the system. And then SharePoint groups of users can be configured to categorize user permissions. And then we make a cross-reference to CS09, which is the configuration specification, which gives us the steps that we need to follow to be able to actually configure the user permissions within SharePoint. So this allows us to map our user requirements to system functionality. This is the latter part of the document, which actually gives us the step-by-step instructions on how to actually configure the various different elements. And this really is useful if we needed to come back and reconfigure a system. We can actually see exactly what were the steps that we followed when we did the initial configuration. Now, in addition to the functional and configuration specification, we have a detailed configuration specification, and this is really the document which allows us to define all of the various different configuration parameters for our SharePoint deployment. And this can actually be a very significant document. There's a lot of different parameters that need to be plugged into the system to be able to configure it for its intended use. So typically we manage the various different elements such as site and library settings, libraries themselves, content types, columns, security groups and user rights, templates and workflow deployments. So which workflows need to be applied to which content types or which libraries. This specification at Montrium, we actually manage it with an Excel spreadsheet which is fairly complex and is version controlled. So every time we want to make a change to our configuration, we first of all update our details configuration specification, we get it approved, we then make the change, we then verify it, and then we close it out. And we maintain that as a version of the configuration which clearly shows us how the system was configured at that point in time. We use our change control procedure to actually manage this specification document. So to give you an idea of the granularity, this is what we call our Space Invader page, which really shows us the various different content types that we're managing in the system. So here we can see the various different clinical content types that we would typically manage if we were doing records management within SharePoint. And then afterwards we have all of the various different metadata columns that we could apply to that particular content type. And then we specify what's required, what's optional, and what's systematically required but hidden. And this allows us really to define exactly how we need to configure all of those different elements. And we do the same thing for things like libraries, lists, sites, and even forms. So once we have all of those specification documents in place, we also have to have a traceability matrix. And the traceability matrix is a really key document which allows us to really understand how all of these different pieces work together. So how we get from a user requirement to a functional specification to potentially a design specification and then to the various different testing documents, so to the IQ, the OQ and the PQ. We can also cross-reference certain SOPs if we needed to. If there were procedural controls, required to meet a particular user requirement. The trace matrix is typically considered a living document, and it really should be versioned and updated using change control. It's a document that's going to live with the system, so every time we do a change control, we're typically going to update the trace matrix. It's also a document that's very useful for inspectors and auditors because it allows them to really understand how all of the requirements were met and how they were tested, because of course we're cross-referencing the test scripts that were executed. It also allows us to identify whether the system has been adequately tested or not. So the trace matrix typically looks like this. Some organizations will use an actual system to manage a trace matrix. Others will do it within a document such as the one you see on screen. Others may use an Excel spreadsheet to do it as well. All of these things are acceptable. The main thing is to be able to link user requirements to functional specifications and then to the relevant tests that were executed to be able to test those specifications and those requirements. So once we have our trace matrix in place, we'll typically then start putting together and executing the various different test documents. And the first one is the configuration testing, or IQ, installation qualification. IQ really ensures that all software modules have been installed correctly. So we'll have a whole series of steps that we have to follow to properly install all of the various different pieces of our solution. We also define the expected results at each control point of the installation. And we'll also make sure the documentation is in place and that the system's been adequately protected. So, for example, making sure that the system is plugged into a UPS if we're dealing with the hardware, making sure that the system's part of the disaster recovery plan, making sure that it's been included in the backup schedule. All these things have to be done, and all of these things are, of course, detailed in the installation qualification and then signed off on saying, yes, we've made sure that this is part of the disaster recovery, for example. It also allows us to verify the structural elements, so have all of the sites and the content types and the security and everything else been deployed properly within the environment. It's recommended that you develop an IQ protocol which really governs the overall installation and configuration process of the system, and that you have IQ scripts for the installation of baseline Sharepoint, as well as all of your third-party add-on applications such as Mintex or Cosign. So this is what an IQ would look like. So the first thing that we have is really all the parameters. So we need to record exactly what are the different parameters, the hardware parameters, for example, that we've implemented in the system. So what we actually expect, so the specification, and then what we actually did. So the actual results. So for example, in the specification, we may put domain, it could be, let's say Montrium, for example, and the actual result was Montrium, so we actually used Montrium. We then have the step-by-step instructions for installation. So this is really going through the installation procedure for SharePoint 2010, as well as for all of the prerequisites, such as configuring SQL Server. And here again, we give very clear instructions. We define any prerequisites required, and then we'll also record any parameters that we use to configure the system. Once we've actually done our IQ and we've verified that everything was installed correctly, there were no errors, we'll then move on to functional testing, or OQ, so operational qualification. And this really consists of positive and negative testing on all of the various different system components. And so this can be very functional in nature. So we actually will execute tests based on the functionality of the system. These tests can be executed by IT as well as by end users, and usually as a combination of both. And these tests will also be governed by a test protocol, which really clearly describes how they need to be executed and what to do should there be a failure, so deviation management procedures. The test scripts are usually broken down into functional areas and will be linked to baseline system functions, which will of course be approved before we actually execute them. When we're executing the test, we have to make sure that we use good documentation practices, so what we call ALCOA. So it needs to be attributable, legible, contemporaneous, original, and accurate. And typically you'll have an SOP which will actually govern those practices. These tests really serve as a mechanism to make sure that the system is operating correctly in its installed environment. So this is what a test looks like. The first part is really the prerequisites. So here we're going to be describing the various different values as well as our test environment that we're going to use. And we clearly describe what those prerequisites need to be. This is really setting up our test environment. We then have test steps. And so we clearly go through each of the different steps that the test executor needs to follow. We'll define expected results and then the actual results. We'll also indicate when evidence needs to be captured. Should it be screenshots or logs? These evidences need to be captured and cross-referenced in the test script. We'll also indicate whether it was a pass or fail and who actually performed the test. If you have a failure, typically we'll also link to a test non-conformance report, which will allow us to actually manage that failure and perform corrective actions so we can perform a retest. The final stage of testing is requirements testing, or PQ, performance qualification. And this really is testing company-specific configurations. And it's usually just positive testing. So we're doing end-to-end business-specific functionality tests, where we're looking at things like workflows. We would also do this kind of testing on InfoPath forms. Again, these tests are governed by a test protocol. They're broken down into test scripts, but instead of by functional area, it's typically by business process. They, of course, also need to follow good documentation practices, and these tests are typically executed by the end users or the stakeholders of the system. These are not technical tests in nature. Now, when we're thinking about baseline SharePoint, we don't actually need to perform PQ on the baseline because we're really just deploying standard functionality. We're not doing any customization really around your business processes. This is really just a straight installation. Once you start deploying applications on top of that baseline, where you have things like workflows and forms and other potential third-party custom elements, that's when you would need to perform PQ in addition to all of the other phases of testing. Once we've completed all of our testing, the final document that we produce, which is an extremely important document when it comes to inspections or audit, is the final validation summary report. And this document really gives us a very clear picture as to how the validation went, what actually occurred. It clearly describes the different deviations that we encountered, and we also make sure that we clearly describe how we closed out those deviations. It provides us with a mechanism to approve the validation and actually allow the system to go into production. So we clearly describe in this validation summary report how we met the intended use or the acceptance criteria, and we clearly state that the system is fit to go into production. Now, we can do just one global validation summary report for all of the phases of testing, or it can be a high-level summary of individual summary reports which were produced after IQ or OQ. This again depends on the scope of validation and also depends quite often on your internal SOP. The summary report should really very clearly show how we followed the validation plan and the protocol and how the acceptance criteria were met. And this is really what the inspector will look at first of all. They'll look to see, okay, did they follow the plan that they outlined for validation? Did they meet their acceptance criteria? And are there any deviations open? That's really what they're looking for. So once you've got your system in a validated state, the next thing that you need to do is you need to make sure that you maintain that system in a validated state, and therefore you need to have configuration control mechanisms. Typically you should have a specific configuration control for SharePoint in addition to any general IT configuration control SOPs that you have in place. This configuration procedure or SOP really should clearly describe how we make the different changes within SharePoint, either to baseline functionality or to custom elements. It should also govern the configuration specification, so the detailed configuration specification, which we spoke about earlier. and it should clearly say that we have to update that configuration specification if we want to make any changes. We also need to make sure that change control is cross-referenced and that we use change control to make any changes to that controlled environment. If we make significant changes, we may actually decide that we need to launch a whole new validation project, and that would obviously be much larger than just filling out a change control form and then executing a change control. For workflows, forms, and then other sort of custom features or solutions, it's also very, very important to perform a risk and impact assessment and then produce adequate test scripts to properly test any changes to that system. The next webinar in our series will actually deal with configuration control in a much more detailed manner, and so if that's an area which is of interest or importance to you, I definitely suggest that you register for that webinar, and I'll tell you when those dates are going to be at the end of today's session. Now let's touch on maximizing quality and return on investment. I think the first thing to remind ourselves of is that validation can be extremely expensive and time-consuming if it's not done properly. So you have to have a very structured, focused approach to validation. By defining a clear validation strategy and by using risk assessment, we're able to really focus and really scope the validation to those areas which we feel present the most risk. And so it's super important to actually perform that exercise. Another thing that you can do is, of course, acquire tried and tested test scripts or validation packages for SharePoint and the third-party applications that you're using. Typically, these packages have already gone through many iterations of validation, and therefore are not very likely to yield deviations and should actually make the whole validation effort much simpler and much faster, in fact. You should also make sure that all individuals involved in the validation effort are fully trained and that they really understand why they're validated and how the CSV process works. It's important that you isolate your controlled or regulated environments from your non-regulated environments so that you can facilitate validation and, more importantly, configuration control. You don't want to have to go through change control every time you make a change to an uncontrolled or non-regulated area. And at the same time, you want to make sure that you protect your regulated area. You should also, if possible, use virtual environments so as to facilitate replication between production and test environments. This is also very useful, of course, for things like disaster recovery. Some lessons learned and best practices. I think that the first thing that you really should do before considering moving forward with SharePoint, or if you want to expand the use of SharePoint in your organization, is to create a big picture. So really try and map out exactly how you think you're going to be using SharePoint within the organization, and make sure that you make a clear separation between controlled or regulated and non-controlled or non-regulated environments. Use a risk-based approach, of course, to focus your validation effort, but be strict, because otherwise everything becomes high risk. Remember that SharePoint is an off-the-shelf product, and therefore you should limit validation scope to really the high business and regulatory risks as much as possible. Put together a SharePoint validation team to oversee and manage the validation process, and make sure that you keep that team in place once you actually deploy SharePoint into production, because they'll also manage all of the changes that you need to make to that environment once the users start using it. Make sure that you implement SOPs and work instructions which clearly define how the environment is configured and administered, and which level of documentation and revalidation would be required for each of the different types of changes that you're going to make in the system. And then finally, try and use a step-by-step deployment methodology to keep things manageable. As I said right at the beginning, SharePoint can be used for many different things, but it's very important to try and remain focused and deploy the various different applications, the regulated and non-regulated applications, in a step-by-step manner so that you can keep things manageable in terms of documentation, as well as user adoption, of course. So my final message to everyone is really try and keep it simple, because it's very easy to drown in the details when it comes to validation. So really try and keep focused and just focus on really what's considered to be high risk and what's relevant to the regulations. So the next webinars that we'll be organizing are on configuration management, which is going to be held on December 8th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time and December 13th at 9 a.m. Eastern Time for our European colleagues. After that, we'll be looking at two different case studies. The first will be deploying SharePoint-based eTMF in the cloud. So this is really looking at how we can use cloud technology and SharePoint to be able to manage the electronic trial master file, which is a fairly significant undertaking for many organizations, and the cloud could be an answer to that. Now that webinar is happening on December 16th at 9 a.m. and then again on the 19th, just before the holidays, at 2 p.m. The final case study, which will be held in the new year, so January 17th and 19th, is on implementing an integrated quality management system in SharePoint. So here we'll be looking at some of the features of SharePoint that we can use to interconnect the various different components of our quality system, and also to build very intuitive dashboards and metrics, which of course are extremely important in being able to measure operational effectiveness as well as any issues and bottlenecks that we're experiencing. So with that, I'm going to bring the webinar to a close. We will leave the webinar open for a few more minutes for you to pose any questions that you have. If you do have other questions afterwards, feel free to drop me an email. You have my contact details here. You can also find them on our website on www.montrium.com. After the webinar closes, there will be a brief survey with a few questions, and if you could provide us with feedback, that would be extremely helpful so that we can then better structure the future webinars. We'll also be sending out details on how you can register for the next webinars. Those details are also available on our webpage under webinars. So thank you everybody for your attendance today. I hope that the webinar was useful and that you have a better insight now into how we can go about validating SharePoint for regulated applications. And I look forward to seeing you again, or at least seeing your attendance again for our next webinars. Thank you very much. Goodbye.